here is a Prime Minister who a couple of years ago was in the United States. You had the Howdy Modi event. He said, Ab ki baar, there was all this sloganeering of Ab ki baar, Trump Sarkar. Mr. Trump comes to India, is greeted euphorically. Trump loses out. The Biden government comes, but the relationship seems to only get strengthened. So has the relationship risen above all partisan political divides, both in the US and here in India?
Yeah, there's absolutely multi-partisan support in Washington and in New Delhi, I think, for this relationship. And I know that some have pointed to some criticism coming from some members of Congress from the Democratic Party who have been critical about the rights and democracy situation in India. But I would argue that criticism on that front should not be taken as opposition to deeper partnership on the whole. And, I remember when India was experiencing that terrible COVID surge back in 2021, some of the very members of Congress that had been critical of India on rights and democratic backsliding issues had been the very first to issue messages of solidarity and support for the Indian people and for U.S.-India partnership during that COVID surge. So, yeah, I think that's been one of the big success stories for the relationship. And this is also not new. I mean, this has been in place for some years. But, if you look back to the civil nuclear deal, which I think was mentioned earlier, there had been some opposition to that deal, both in Washington and in New Delhi. But we've come a long way from that. I think at this point, you're not going to have much significant levels of opposition from any one political party to any type of broader agreement that would advance U.S.-India partnership. And I think that's an indication of just how far things have come. But just I wanted to agree with what Dan had said earlier about how the issue of China in recent years, and particularly the increasing provocations and activities that China has undertaken, I think has sharpened the urgency on both sides for the need to work more closely. Both India and the United States have seen their relations with China plummet to their worst levels in many years, and especially since 2020. And I think that's significant. But this is the arc of the relationship is notable in that if you go back to 60 years, almost to this week, you had the first state visit by an Indian leader. That's when President Radhakrishnan arrived in Washington June of 1963. And looking back at the footage and the commentary on that visit, what were the messages? What were the themes? Well, two largest democracies in the world. You saw a lot of that. And also a lot of focus on how the two countries would work together to counter Chinese aggression. This was in 1963. Obviously, things would take a different direction later on when the U.S. would get closer to Pakistan and the U.S. began to see China as an opportunity, not a threat, until we came back to where things have been the last few years, where China became a competitor in the eyes of the U.S. That opened a pathway for a resumption of partnership between the U.S. and India on grade levels. So it's an interesting, complex trajectory, but in some ways we've come back full circle to where we were in 1963.
Amitabh Mattu, just looking at that arc again, you've got a situation where the civil nuclear agreement is signed by Manmohan Singh in 2005. But you come to 2008, and by 2008, you've got the left parties which oppose it, withdraw support to the Manmohan Singh government. That slows down some of the defense cooperation between the two countries. Now you're in 2023, you're going to have technology transfers. You've had some element of criticism at times of the Modi government in the US on democratic rights, on human rights. President Obama spoke of religious freedom. Mr. Markey, do you believe that these issues no longer matter, therefore, that even if some individual may raise it today in the US Congress, or there may be those in India who might have question marks over US defense deals with India, do you believe all of that is behind us? We have a complete bipartisan consensus, in your view, Mr. Markey, in both countries?
Oh, sorry. No, I don't believe that it's all behind us. I think politics are politics, and they will continue. I think that the United States, when it thinks about India, has traditionally and continues to see India as appealing for an expectation of shared democratic values. And I think that that will be a critical part of how we assess the nature of our relationship. And to the extent that that persists or grows or improves, I think there's plenty of political space, as we've already discussed here in Washington, a bipartisan consensus that favors closer partnership. But if that erodes, And if there are deeper concerns, then it will have political consequences. And I think,
What are those
look, your
concerns? Are there
history
any
that you
concerns
did.
at all? Daniel Markey, do you want to flag up? Is there any principal concern that could prevent this relationship from becoming this full-blown alliance that some are speaking about?
Yeah, look, India's worldview, even as a democratic state, is not and has not been identical to that of the United States. And that's part of what your history showed, actually. Through that entire history, except for the period of the emergency, India has been a democracy, and so has the United States been a democracy. And yet, our worldviews have not aligned. And throughout the Cold War, we did not see eye to eye on a variety of issues. Pakistan has been mentioned, the Soviet Union has been mentioned. So democracy alone hasn't been a determinant of the U.S.-India relationship. But it is an important part of how Americans, at least, have perceived India, and it shaped expectations for what they thought they would get from India. And at times, I think it shaped them in ways that have led to more misunderstanding than good understanding. And I think that continues to be a potential concern going forward.